welcome to the Disc Golf Doctor. Today we're going to talk about forehand or flick rollers. It's something that can be extremely useful, really save you some strokes, but is often underutilized. Today we want to talk about what situations you would use it in, what sort of terrain you need for it, and how you would go into disc selection based on the type of shot you want to get and the type of angle you want to accomplish. I made a simple diagram here to illustrate a couple basic points before we get into the clips. What you can see here is moving from right to left. You can use a disc that's more stable to less stable. From right to left again, throwing with less speed to more speed. That's not necessarily the speed of the disc, the number on it, but how fast you're actually throwing it, or how steep of how much of an angle you're putting on it, whether it's more of an angle to the right and more vertical to the left. Right, so if we throw it with the path that we see on the right, that's called a cut roller. When you put it at a steeper angle or you use a more stable disc, or even if you throw it at less speed, it's going to want to curl to the right and not stand up all the way. And that's going to vary if you throw with a little less stability or a little more speed or less of an angle or more vertical of an angle that is. You're going to get that second flight path, and then that third one from the right. Again, if you throw less stability, more speed, more vertical of an angle, you'll get that, and likewise for the next one. So those are all factors that go into this selection, is how fast are you going to throw it, how stable is the disc, and at what angle you're going to put it down at. You can manipulate all those things. So you could take a fairly understable disc and put it at a really steep angle, and you may still be able to get a cut roller. Or you could take a really stable disc and put it at a very vertical angle and still get it to curl to the left. All those are factors. You also need to consider other factors that go into just every other throw we do. If you're throwing into a headwind, it's going to act less stable. It's going to turn over a little more easily. If you're throwing a tailwind, the opposite. So keep those basic things in mind. When you really think about it too, this is the same thing that the flight pass that you would get with a normal forehand anyways. So if you throw a more stable forehand and you throw it flat, it's going to want to dive to the right eventually. I think the only major difference, and some may disagree, I don't know, but is that the tendency is that the disc does really want to curl to the left at the end. Even if you're throwing for something fairly stable, if you don't throw at a really steep angle, it'll want to stand up and it'll want to curl to the left in many instances. Now we're going to go over a few clips that illustrate situations you would use the forehand roller in, and we can talk about disc selection with that. This first clip, to give the whole context, is a 90-degree dogleg left. Your first shot, you're trying to get out into the fairway so you have an approach up to the hole. You can kind of see the pin there in that little grove with the wood chips. So you could go further left to start with to get a closer shot, but in reality, you actually want to be off to the right so you have a better angle in at the hole because it's guarded by these trees. So here you can see I'm putting the disc down at a little bit of an angle, hoping it stands up and curls into the left to get around those guardian trees there. I'm using a relatively understable disc here because I really want to make sure that it stands up and then curls to the left, like I said. You can see it comes down, not that steep of an angle, not quite vertical. If you throw it too vertical, then it's going to turn over to the left and curl prematurely. But I want it to climb up that hill, and what I tend to find is actually as it's finishing up the hill, even if it's at a bit of an angle, it wants to really curl to the left at the very top. Here I'm doing it with a different disc. This is actually a Valkyrie. It's a bit flippy of a disc. I put it down at an angle there again. Didn't let it go in the air as far, so that's another factor. But you can see it there curl in right in those wood chips. Your flight is going to be different based on whether you put it down right away or whether you let it fly for a little bit. The angle will be different too, just based on the stability. Right? If I throw an understable disc and give it some air for a while, it's going to want to keep turning over and it's going to change the angle. If I get it down pretty soon, I can control the angle a little bit better by just knowing what angle I'm releasing it at, rather than knowing the disc and knowing the wind as well. This is the hole that I learned how to throw forehand rollers on because it's a very tricky hole. The pin is, maybe if you follow the camera view, straight through me and a little bit to the right. I don't know if you can tell from this image, but there's some pine trees that give it a really low ceiling. So even if you throw a really hard forehand with a stable disc, it's really hard to get the distance to get anywhere near that pin. So what I tend to do is take a fairly stable disc and throw it at a decently steep angle and get it to cut roll to the right. It can be risky because there's out of bounds to the right and short of the basket, but you can see a little steeper of an angle than I did on the previous hole. And not only that, but I'm combining a steeper angle with a more stable disc. I'm actually throwing a big germ Thunderbird with this. I find it likes to hold that cut angle to the right much better. So I'm giving it a little bit of distance here, right, before it lands, but I know since it's fairly stable, it's not going to turn over. It's going to keep that angle to a degree. And if you can follow it, it keeps curling. It's going to kind of come back into view a little bit better in a moment as it's passing by that tree in the distance, and it's going to keep curling to the right. This shot here is more of a typical forehand roller, just like you would do a backhand roller. It would just go the opposite way. I'm going to use an understable disc and throw it. In this case, I'm actually throwing it at a slight hyzer, and I know it's super understable. It's a DX Valkyrie that's extremely beat in, and I know it'll turn over and land on its edge. But you could take a slightly more stable disc than I'm using here and start it at more of an angle and accomplish a similar thing. I wouldn't typically use it on this hole because it's slightly uphill and it stalls out a little bit early, but you can see a little hyzer out of my hand, but it turns over, lands on its edge, and will continue to roll. And you can see in the distance it stands up and gets some decent distance actually. Again, follow through. I'm basically throwing a normal forehand. I'm just using a really understable disc that I know will continue to turn over. See a little bit hyzer, but it's turning, and then landing on its edge there. It's going to roll to the right a little bit until it slowly starts to stand up, and eventually you can't quite see it because it goes over the ridge, but it would curl to the left ultimately. I'm sure if you've watched any disc golf coverage, you've seen this use of a roller. This is a recovery shot from the woods. I will almost always use it if I'm stuck in the woods on the left and I don't really have much of a backhand available to me. There's a lot of variation you can do with disc selection. You can change how far you throw it before it lands. It really depends on the situation. But I know for sure I've saved strokes using this to get out of sticky situations. The first disc I'm using here is a T-Bird, I believe. And I'm going to throw it. I'm trying to get it vertical, not quite enough on that throw. So it started moving a little bit right, even though I want to move left because the hole follows the tree line. That second disc is a T-Bird 3, a little more stable, and I get it down at more of a vertical angle. But if I can get out of that woods and advance at the same time, then I'm not just pitching out and essentially taking a penalty stroke for lack of extra distance. But if I can gain some distance, I can make the subsequent shot a little bit simpler, then it really becomes advantageous. So pretty vertical here. It's starting to move left by the time it's exiting the screen there. It's going to keep curling left. This video illustrates a couple of key points. On this hole, the pin is near where that wall meets the tree line in the distance, straight ahead from the point of the camera. And so you could go left of that big tree in the way, but it's hard to get it to move right far enough, even with a really powerful forehand and a stable disc. So what some people will do is they'll go down the middle, kind of to the right of that tree with a roller. It's got a low ceiling because of the grove of trees right in front of us and that big tree in the middle with the branches hanging there. So you can't really throw a backhand down that way easily because there's even a tree beyond that also pinches it off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a fairly stable disc, that Thunderbird again. I'm going to throw it at a pretty steep angle, get it to land moving to the right. So it's going to start with that cut, but as the terrain levels out, it's going to turn over to the left at the very end, curl and finish, kind of right along that tree line, hopefully, typically. So the nice thing about this is it's downhill, so the terrain's not going to slow it down. It's fairly level. There's no roots to really stop it. And it's angled slightly to the right, so it's going to prevent that disc from standing up prematurely and turning left on me and ending up way out in that field. So it's nice that it's facing to the right to prevent that tipping, and then it flattens out to allow it to curl to the left at the very end so it doesn't actually go too far. This is a great clip of Nate Sexton throwing down a roller, a little bit of an angle with a fairly stable disc. You can see it doesn't want to turn over until towards the end, and then it's turning left but still standing up, really getting a lot of distance. He uses a T-bird here, and thanks to Central Coast Disc Golf for this clip. Just wanted to give you an illustration of use of it on the pro level effectively with kind of a lower ceiling and lots of obstacles in the way. In review, these are a few reasons you might use the forehand roller. Number one is definitely a low ceiling. It takes that entirely out of the question, and you can typically get pretty good distance out of it nonetheless. Also use it for those recovery shots to help advance the disc while also getting it out if you don't have the backhand available to you. I find it really helpful to have a left to right terrain, that is the left side being slightly higher than the right, not significantly, but just a little bit. That'll help prevent the disc from turning over prematurely, and you can get really good distance out of that. And of course, just to show off your amazing technical skills. If you have friends who don't know how to do that, it makes you look like you're a much better player than you are. So a lot of it's just going out and learning each disc, learning what angle to put it down at and how fast to throw it. Just takes time and practice, but it's actually not that hard if you have a functioning forehand already. All right, what kind of situations not to use a forehand roller in? The one obvious one is tree roots, rocks. Don't use it because you hit one of those and it's going to fall over and not go anywhere. One not to typically use it in is if the terrain is really uneven, the up and down and side to side. It can be very hard to predict what the disc is going to do and really mess with your accuracy. Other basic ones are if the grass isn't cut, if it's fairly long, it's going to grab that disc, or if the grass is wet, it's going to want to grab that disc and slow it down prematurely. Don't tend to use it when it's a really steep incline. Obviously, gravity is just going to slow you down, and it's hard to really get the distance doing that, unless there's a really specific situation that would force you to do that. I wouldn't use it in that situation.